She was a runaway bride, beaten and left for dead in a Wyoming blizzard. He was a grieving mountain man who had sworn off the world, haunted by the ghosts of his past. When he found her half-frozen body, he saved her life. But could she save his? Hello, my friends, and welcome to Frontier Rescue Stories, with another tale from the Old West. Before we move further into our story, I want to thank you for being here. If you enjoy these tales of survival and redemption, help us reach a larger audience by hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this story with a friend. And don't forget to drop a comment below letting us know what part of the world you're watching from today. We love to hear from you. Now let's begin. The Wyoming high country was a place of brutal, unforgiving beauty. But in the grips of a late spring blizzard, it was just brutal. The wind howled like a mourning woman, driving ice and snow so thick it erased the world. Through this white hell, Elara Vance stumbled, her body screaming in protest. She was fleeing, but she wasn't just running from the storm. She was running from a man. The thin, torn silk of her wedding dress offered no protection against the cold. It was a cruel mockery of the life she had briefly, horribly, been forced into. Her face was a tapestry of pain, her left eye swollen shut, her lip split and a dark, ugly bruise spreading across her jaw. Just 4 days ago, her father, a man broken by debt, had sold her in a business deal to Silas Blackwood, a wealthy, cruel man from Cheyenne. The wedding night had been a blur of terror, a nightmare of violence that had shattered her last hopes. She had fled on horseback, but the horse had given out miles back, succumbing to the cold. Now Elara was alone. She fell into a deep snowdrift, the icy cold seeping into her bones. She had no strength left to fight it. The cold was so profound it almost felt warm, a dangerous, seductive peace. She thought of Silas Blackwood, of his cold eyes and heavy hands, and then she thought of the biting snow. She decided with a strange sense of calm that the snow was kinder. Death, she realized, was a better alternative than the life she had fled. She closed her eyes, letting the storm take her, letting the numbness creep into her hands and feet. At least here, in the heart of the blizzard, she was free. The world was fading to a peaceful, silent white. She was letting go, her breath a shallow mist in the air. But as the last of her consciousness slipped away, a dark shape broke through the swirling white chaos. It was huge, silent, and moving toward her. The dark shape had been a man. Elara woke with a gasp, the sudden pain of drawing a sharp breath making her cry out. Her whole body was an orchestra of agony. She wasn't in the snow. She was inside, lying on a rough-hewn bed covered by a heavy buffalo hide. A stone fireplace crackled in the corner, casting the simple, one-room cabin in a dim, flickering light. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. Where was she? Who had brought her here? She tried to sit up, but her muscles refused to obey. Then she saw him. He was sitting on a stool by the fire, his back to her. He was a large man, his shoulders broad under a worn buckskin shirt. He seemed to be sharpening a hunting knife. The scrape of steel on stone, the only sound in the room. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through her. She had escaped one monster only to be captured by another. He must have heard her gasp, because he stopped his work. He stood slowly, and when he turned, Elara had to stifle a scream. He was a mountain of a man, weather-beaten and rugged, with a thick beard and eyes the color of winter ice. He looked at her not with concern or even curiosity, but with a heavy, grieving silence. He was, she thought, the very embodiment of the harsh, unforgiving mountains outside. He said nothing. He simply walked to the hearth, ladled some thick stew into a wooden bowl, and grabbed a cup of water. He placed them on the floor by her bed, just out of her reach, before retreating to his stool by the fire and turning his back to her once more. Elara stared at the food, then at his broad, unmoving back. She had expected questions or threats or worse. This silence was something else entirely. It was not threatening. It was empty. He was treating her like a wounded animal he had brought in from the cold, nothing more. This simple, impersonal act of leaving her food and then pointedly ignoring her was the most confusing and most profound act of kindness she had ever known. She didn't know his name or why he had saved her. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she was in the presence of a man and she wasn't terrified. She was just confused. He said nothing, just sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, the silence in the cabin as loud as the howling wind outside. The howling wind outside was nothing compared to the storm of confusion in Elara's mind. For 2 days they existed in this strange silence. The mountain man would leave for hours at a time, presumably checking traps, and return without a word. He would leave food for her, add wood to the fire, and then sit, staring into the flames, lost in a world she couldn't begin to guess at. Elara's strength slowly returned. Her bruises began to turn a sickly yellow, and the swelling in her eye went down. She could finally sit up without the world spinning. On the third morning he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting. "You're strong enough to move," he said, not looking at her. "The storm's passed. I can take you to Three Forks. It's the nearest settlement." Elara's blood ran cold. Three Forks was just a trading post. From there, Silas Blackwood could find her in a day. "I can't," she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "I can't go to a town. He'll find me." The man finally turned to look at her, his icy gaze holding no pity, only a quiet understanding. "Running from someone," he stated. It wasn't a question. Elara just nodded, pulling the buffalo hide tighter. He grunted, turning back to the fire. "I had a housekeeper," he said after a long pause. "An old woman. She left before the winter, went to live with her sister." He gestured to a small, attached lean-to, a room built onto the side of the main cabin. "That was her room. It has its own door. You can stay. Earn your keep." Elara's heart stopped. "Earn my keep? How?" "I need a cook. Someone to mend my gear. The cabin's a mess." He looked around the dusty, cluttered room as if seeing it for the first time. "I can pay you a little, but you'll have shelter, and he won't find you here. No one comes to Salvation Creek." Elara knew she should be afraid. This man was a stranger, and he lived in total isolation. But his offer was a lifeline. It wasn't charity. It was a contract, a job. It was a safe, non-threatening container for her to heal. He even provided her with some of his late wife's mended. Practical clothes, a simple wool skirt and a flannel shirt that swallowed her small frame. "I accept," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm Elara Vance," he nodded once. Jonah Stone." He pointed to the lean-to. "That's your space. I'll keep to mine." Elara moved into the small, cold room. It was little more than a closet with a cot and a small table. But the separate door was a symbol of freedom. She began to work. She scrubbed the floors, aired out the dusty blankets, and cooked a hot meal that night. She was still a prisoner in a way, not of a man, but of her fear, and of this strange, isolated place. It was a prison, yes, but its walls were built of kindness, and that was the strangest prison of all. Of all the things Elara had expected in this new life, the quiet wasn't one of them. She had lived her whole life in a house filled with the noise of her father's failures and the shouting of her stepbrothers. Silas Blackwood's mansion had been full of the cold, sharp sounds of servants and echoing footsteps on marble floors. But Jonah Stone's cabin was silent. It was a heavy, weighted silence born of solitude and something deeper. As weeks passed, Elara's physical wounds healed. The bruises faded, and her eye opened, but the scars on her spirit remained. She worked tirelessly, turning the dusty, lifeless cabin into a home. She scrubbed the soot from the hearth, mended Jonah's torn buckskins, and organized his chaotic supplies. She was proving her worth, earning the safety he had given her. Jonah remained a mystery. He was a man of shadows and routine. He would leave before dawn and return at dusk, sometimes with game, sometimes with nothing but the cold clinging to him. They rarely spoke, exchanging only necessary words about food or weather. But Elara watched him. She saw the way his eyes would linger on the small, empty child's chair in the corner, or how his hand would sometimes ghost over the worn carving of a woman's head on his rifle stock. He was a man haunted by ghosts, she realized. One night a noise woke her. It was late. The fire burned down to glowing embers. She peered from her lean-to door into the main room. Jonah wasn't in his bed. He was sitting on the floor by the hearth, his back to her, his shoulders shaking. He was holding something small and dark in his hands. He was whispering, his voice thick with a grief so raw it made Elara's own chest ache. "Anna, I'm sorry. Ben, my boy." Elara froze, feeling like she was trespassing on something sacred. He was holding a small carved wooden bird, turning it over and over in his rough hands. It was a child's toy, Anna, Ben, his wife, his son. Elara quietly slipped back into her room, her heart breaking for this silent, grieving man. In that moment, his gruffness, his silence, his distance, it all made sense. He wasn't a monster. He was a man hollowed out by grief, trapped in a cabin that was not just his home, but his tomb. He was just as broken as she was. The discovery of his secret grief changed everything. Elara stopped being afraid of Jonah Stone. She still respected his boundaries, his need for silence, but she no longer saw him as a potential threat. She saw him as a fellow survivor. She began to push back against the ghosts in the cabin. Not with words, but with life. She found a tattered child's blanket tucked in an old chest. Ben's, she assumed. Instead of leaving it to rot, she carefully washed it, mended the worn edges, and folded it neatly on the small empty chair. Jonah saw it. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the mended blanket for a long time, and the next day, he brought her a small sack of flour from his stores, a silent thank you. Elara, who had been taught that her voice was a thing to be kept quiet, began to hum as she worked, old folk songs her mother had taught her. At first, Jonah tensed, as if the sound of life in the cabin was a violation. But as the days passed, he seemed to relax. One afternoon, as she was kneading bread, she began to sing the words softly. Jonah, who was mending a trap by the fire, went very still. She stopped, blushing, afraid she had overstepped. "Don't stop," he said, his voice rough. It's been a long time since there was music in this house." So she continued, her voice filling the small, sad space. Jonah's armor of grief was beginning to crack. He started to talk, not about his past, but about the land. He took her outside and showed her how to set a simple snare, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he guided hers. He taught her which roots were for stew and which were for fever. They shared labor, mending a broken fence line together, moving in a comfortable, quiet rhythm. The silence between them was no longer heavy and empty. It was shared. One evening, she used some of her flour ration and the dried apples shed. Found to make a simple apple pie. She set a piece in front of him. He stared at it for a long time. Then he took a bite. He ate the whole piece in silence. When he was done, he looked at her, his icy eyes clear for the first time. "My wife, Anna, she used to make pie," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud to another. The brutal winter finally gave way to a vibrant, sudden spring. Meltwater roared in the creek, and the valley floor exploded in a carpet of purple lupine and yellow mule's ear. The change in the land was mirrored in the cabin. With the melting of the snow came the melting of Jonah Stone. He was still a quiet man, still marked by his loss, but he was no longer a ghost. He was present. Elara, too, was transformed. The bruises on her face were a distant memory. The terror that had lived in her bones for so long had finally receded. She was strong, healthy, and for the first time in her life, she felt safe. She had planted a small garden behind the cabin, a patch of green hope against the brown earth. She felt a fierce, protective love for this small cabin, this harsh valley, and the broken man who had given her refuge. They had built a fragile domestic peace, a life defined by shared chores and quiet companionship, but it was a life without joy. The final piece of the thaw came on a warm afternoon in early summer. Jonah was on the cabin roof replacing shingles damaged by the winter storms. Elara was in her garden, weeding her rows of beans. She heard a crack, a startled shout, and then a tremendous crash. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Jonah was gone. The ladder lay on the ground, and there, in the middle of her bean patch, was Jonah Stone, lying flat on his back in a massive puddle of mud from the spring overflow. He was covered from head to toe. Elara ran to him, terrified he was hurt, that his back was broken. "Jonah, are you hurt? Speak to me." He lay still for a long second, his eyes wide with shock. Then he groaned, not in pain, but in sheer disbelief at his own clumsiness. He wiped a gallon of mud from his face, looking utterly ridiculous. Elara stared, her fear giving way to something else, a bubble of amusement that rose in her chest. She tried to stifle it, but it burst out. She laughed. A real free, unrestrained laugh. It was the first time she had truly laughed in years. Jonah stared up at her, stunned by the sound. Then the corners of his eyes crinkled. A slow, rusty smile cracked his stoic face. And then he laughed too, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the ground. The ice was finally completely broken. But in the town of Cheyenne, 100 miles away, a man named Silas Blackwood had just received word from a trapper. He finally had a lead on his runaway bride. The laughter they had shared echoed in the small valley for days. It had changed their simple, quiet life, ushering in an ease that felt both wonderful and dangerous. They started to eat their meals together at the small table. Not just in the same room, Jonah would tell her stories about the animals he tracked, and she would tell him about the garden she was growing. They were, in all the ways that mattered, a family of two. This new fragile piece made Jonah decide it was time to risk a trip to the settlement of three. Forks, they needed supplies. Flour, salt, new seeds for Elara's garden, and cartridges for his rifle. Elara, desperate for a change of scenery and feeling a new confidence, asked to go with him. He was hesitant, but her laughter had made him soft. He agreed. The settlement was a single dusty street with a general store, a blacksmith and a saloon. As they tied their horses outside the store, Elara felt the stares of the few trappers and merchants. It made her skin crawl, a reminder of a world she had gladly left behind. Jonah, sensing her discomfort, put a hand lightly on her back. "Stay close," he murmured. While Jonah was negotiating with the storekeeper, Elara browsed the shelves, marveling at the bolts of colorful fabric. That's when she heard his voice. Well, I had heard rumors, but I didn't believe them. My runaway wife playing pioneer." Elara froze. The blood drained from her face. She turned slowly. Silas Blackwood was standing in the saloon doorway across the street, a cruel smile on his handsome, hateful face. He was flanked by two hard-looking men, bounty hunters by the look of them. Jonah was at her side in an instant, moving so fast she barely saw him. His hand was on the pistol at his hip. "She's not your wife," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. "Oh, but she is," Blackwood said, taking a step into the street. "The law is quite clear. She belongs to me, and I've come to collect my property." The entire street had gone silent. Jonah pushed Elara behind him, shielding her. "She's not property, and she's not leaving." Blackwood's smile faded. "I don't know who you are, old man, but you're making a fatal mistake." "I have a paper here that says she's mine. Give her to me, or we'll take her." Jonah's face was grim. He knew he couldn't win a gunfight in the middle of town, not with Elara to protect. "This isn't the place," Jonah said. "You'll have to come to my land to discuss it." Blackwood laughed. "Gladly." Jonah grabbed Elara's arm and pulled her back into the store. "The back way now!" They ran, leaving their supplies, and fled the town, racing back toward the safety of the mountains. He entered the cabin and found Elara humming by the fire. He closed the door, his voice low and urgent. "Elara, he's here." The name Silas Blackwood hit Elara like a physical blow, bringing back the icy terror of her wedding night. She had thought she was free, but the past had a long, cruel reach. They barricaded the door and loaded the rifles. The comfortable peace of their home shattered. "He'll come," Elara said, her voice shaking. "He won't give up." "He doesn't know how." Jonah was checking the hinges on the wooden shutters. His face was a mask of grim determination. "He'll find this valley is not as welcoming as Cheyenne." His gaze fell on her, and his expression softened, replaced by a deep, aching regret. "Elara, this is my fault. I brought you into this." He grabbed a sack and began stuffing it with dried meat, ammunition, and a water skin. "There's a trail north of here, over the pass. It leads to a different territory. I can get you there before he finds this cabin. I'll give you money, supplies. You can start a new life where he'll never find you." He was offering her an escape. He was offering to send her away to keep her safe. A few months ago, she would have taken it without a second thought. But as she looked at this man, this kind, broken, silent man who had shared his grief with her, who had laughed with her in the mud, she felt something harden in her chest. It was not fear. It was rage. "No," she said. Jonah stopped packing. "What did you say?" "No." Elara's voice was steady, clear. "I've been running my whole life. I ran from my father's house. I ran from Blackwood. I ran from the storm. I am done running." She walked over and took the sack from his hands. "This cabin—" "This is the only place I have ever felt safe. It's the only home I have ever known. You gave me that, Jonah. I won't let him take it from us." Jonah stared at her, his icy eyes searching her face. He saw no fear, only a strength that matched the mountains themselves. "He's a killer." "Elara, he'll kill you to get what he wants. Then he'll have to kill me," she replied, picking up Jonah's spare rifle and checking its load, with a steady hand he himself had taught her. "But he won't get to do it while I'm running. I'm staying. I'm fighting. With you." Jonah looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not a victim he had rescued, but an equal, a warrior. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "All right," he said, nodding once. "We fight. He will kill you," Jonah said. "He will have to kill us," she replied. They didn't have to wait long. An hour before dusk, 3 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Silas Blackwood sat on his fine black horse, flanked by his 2 hired guns. They were arrogant, casual, like men coming to collect a piece of stray livestock. "Stone!" Blackwood shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "I am a reasonable man. I'm willing to pay you for your trouble. $100 for the girl. That's more than she's worth." Jonah and Elara watched from the cabin's small shuttered windows. "She's not for sale," Jonah shouted back, his voice like rolling thunder. This was his public declaration. He was no longer just a grieving loner. He was Elara's defender. "I see," Blackwood sneered. "So you're not her savior. You're her new owner." "It doesn't matter. I'll have what's mine." Blackwood nodded to one of his men. The man dismounted, a torch in his hand. "He's going for the barn." Elara whispered, horrified. "Let him," Jonah said, his jaw tight. "It's just wood. We are in here." Man touched the torch to the dry hay, sticking out of the small barn. It erupted in flames, the fire crackling and roaring, sending a column of thick black smoke into the twilight sky. Blackwood clearly hoped the fire would smoke them out, force them from the safety of the cabin. Jonah raised his rifle, took careful aim, and fired. The man who had set the fire cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. The battle had begun. "One down," Jonah muttered, reloading. The other bounty hunter returned fire, bullets thudding into the thick logs of the cabin. "Stay down, Elara," Jonah commanded, moving to the other window. He fired again, forcing the second man to dive for cover behind a water trough. The valley was filled with the smell of gunpowder and burning hay. Elara watched Jonah, his face a mask of concentration, a skilled and dangerous man protecting his home. But as she looked past him through the window, she saw the flames from the barn. They were growing, casting terrible dancing shadows. And she saw Jonah's face. His eyes were fixed on the fire, his knuckles white on his rifle. He was breathing too fast. "Jonah?" she said, but he didn't seem to hear her. As the fire grew, Elara saw Jonah's face go pale, his eyes fixed on the flames, his hands shaking. The siege had just awakened his deepest ghost. The first shot cracked through the twilight, fired by one of Blackwood's men. Jonah had fired back, wounding him, but the fight was far from over. The second bounty hunter was pinned behind the trough, and Blackwood himself was using his horse for cover. "This is pointless, Stone," Blackwood shouted, his voice strained with anger. "You're protecting stolen goods. Just send her out." "She's not goods," Elara screamed back from the window, surprising herself with her own venom. "And I will never be yours." Her voice, clear and defiant, seemed to enrage Blackwood. He raised his pistol and fired wildly at the cabin. "Burn it all!" he roared to his remaining man. "If I can't have her, no one will." Blackwood, seeing the barn fire hadn't been enough, dismounted. He grabbed the torch his man had dropped, lit it from the burning barn, and charged the cabin. Jonah fired, but Blackwood was moving, using the smoke as cover. He hurled the torch onto the cabin's dry, shingled roof. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small line of orange snaked up the roof. The cabin was on fire. "Jonah, the roof," Elara yelled. But Jonah wasn't looking at the roof. He was staring, mesmerized, at the flames climbing the wall of the barn, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Jonah!" Elara shook his arm, but he didn't respond. He was staring at the fire as if it were a living demon. He was seeing a different fire, a different night, hearing the screams of a woman and a child. The trauma of losing Anna and Ben had ambushed him, paralyzing him more completely than any bullet ever could. He dropped his rifle, a low moan escaping his throat. He was gone, lost in a memory of flames. Outside, Blackwood laughed, a triumphant, cruel sound. He saw his moment. He stepped out from behind his horse, raising his pistol for a clear, killing shot at the frozen, unmoving man in the window. "Jonah!" Elara screamed, but he was lost. There was no time to think, only to act. Blackwood was aiming. Jonah was a ghost. The fire was roaring, and smoke began to fill the cabin. Elara's survival instincts, honed by years of abuse and a desperate flight, took over. She looked at Jonah, her heart breaking. And then at the hearth, where the heavy, cast-iron skillet she used every day was sitting. With a scream of pure rage, Elara grabbed the skillet. It was heavy, but her adrenaline was surging. She ran to the window, and with all the strength in her body, she hurled it. The skillet spun through the air, striking Silas Blackwood square in the chest. It wasn't enough to kill him, but the sudden, brutal impact of 20 pounds of iron knocked the breath from his body and sent him staggering backward. His aim ruined. His shot went wild, burying itself in the log frame above Jonah's head. Blackwood fell to his knees, gasping for air, his pistol lost in the mud. Elara didn't wait to see what happened next. The cabin was an inferno. "Jonah, we have to go!" she screamed, grabbing his arm. He was still catatonic, staring at the flames that were now eating the curtains. She slapped him hard across the face. "Jonah, I am not Anna." "You will not lose me!" The name, the slap, something broke through. His eyes focused on her, confused, terrified. "Elara?" "We have to go, now!" She grabbed him by his shirt and physically dragged him toward the door, pulling his dead weight as the heat scorched their backs. The second bounty hunter, seeing his boss down and the cabin lost, scrambled for his horse and fled into the darkness. Elara kicked open the cabin door and pulled Jonah out into the cold night air just as the main roof beam collapsed, sending a shower of embers into the sky. They fell onto the muddy ground, coughing, gasping, their home burning to the ground behind them. Jonah woke up fully, the cold air clearing his head. The smell of smoke no longer a memory, but a terrible reality. He looked at the inferno, then at Elara, her face smudged with soot, her eyes fierce and alive. He had frozen. He had failed. And she had saved him. She had saved him from the fire. They had lost everything, the cabin, the shelter, the small life they had built. But as Jonah looked at Elara, he knew he had just gained the only thing that mattered. They watched the last embers of their home die as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and hopeful pink. They were huddled together under a single salvaged blanket from the lean-to, which had been slower to burn. They were homeless, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. 2 rifles in each other. The survival theme that had defined their lives was now raw and immediate. They were back to nothing. Jonah finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse from smoke. "It was a fire," he whispered, staring at the ashes. "Just like this. It took them. Anna and Ben. I was in town for supplies and a storm. I couldn't get back in time. I froze. Last night I saw it again." He turned to her, his face a map of grief and newfound clarity. "You saved me from the snow. Elara, when I was just a ghost, you gave me a reason to be a man again. But last night, you saved me from the fire. You saved me from them." He was free. His ghost, the one that had held him captive in that cabin for years, had been exorcised by a new reality, a new fire. "I love you, Elara Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I've loved you since you laughed at me in the mud. I was just too afraid to admit it." Elara looked at the smoldering ruins of the cabin, the only true home she had ever known, and she felt nothing. The fear was gone. Blackwood was gone. The past was finally gone. She turned to Jonah, this good, broken man who saw her, who had fought for her, and who she had fought for. "I love you too, Jonah Stone," she whispered, her own tears tracing clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. They're just ashes now," he said, looking at the ruin. Elara shook her head. She took his hand, their fingers lacing together. "Ashes are good," she said, a small, strong smile touching her lips. "Ashes are what you're left with when you burn away everything that's dead. It's what's left so you can build something new." Jonah looked at her, his heart so full he could barely breathe. She was right. They had lost everything, but they had survived. They were not defined by their scars, but by the fact that they had survived them, together. Hand in hand they turned from the ashes of the past and walked toward the sunrise, ready to build a new home together. And so Elara and Jonah's journey of healing truly begins, not in a safe cabin but in the ashes of the old, with the promise of a new life built by 2 survivors. If you enjoyed this story of survival and second chances, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with someone who loves a tale of the Old West. Don't forget to subscribe to Frontier Rescue Stories and check out our playlist for more tales of love and redemption. What was your favorite part of Jonah and Elara's story? Let us know in the comments below, along with any suggestions you have for a future tale. We wish you all the best and we'll see you in the next story.